afternoon. I will talk today about inspections, subject of which I pretend to know little. Do international inspection activities raise questions of international law? Yes. Drawing up and applying rules regarding access for international inspectors to sensitive installations involve often striking balances between government's concept of sovereignty and government's aversion against external activities in their territories, and their need, on the other hand, to show transparency in order to gain confidence that activities in nuclear and some other fields do not have military aims. Inspection, verification and monitoring sound like very dry, technical accountancy matters, and in part they are. Like accountancy in banking, accountancy in the nuclear, chemical and biological fields include checking the accounts and see if they tally. And as one checks that gold and other securities are really in the bank vaults, inspectors check that weapons of mass destruction related material and equipment and installations are not for military purposes. The weapons inspectors start from the bookkeeping and then go into the declared sites to check that the items correspond to what has been declared. They take samples of nuclear material to verify its isotopic composition, degree of enrichment, if any, etc. The state is obliged to give a declaration that is both correct and complete of its inventories. The more difficult part of the verifier's task is to establish whether the declaration is complete. In the case of Iraq, it became evident soon after the Gulf War, 1991, that the declarations given to the UN and to the IEA were far from complete. Monitoring, verification and inspection, for brevity I shall often refer to them only as inspection, is mostly accepted but rarely loved in our national spheres. However, we are used in our national spheres to tax and customs inspectors, to elevator and fire inspectors, and a host of other personnel whom Big Brother sends around. The governments checking on us are themselves even more jealous about the privacy of their territories and have accepted international visits and oversight only because they have reluctantly concluded that it is in their interest to do so. While the need to create confidence about the absence of weapons of mass destruction is the most common ground for states to accept international visits and oversight, other grounds are actually turning up. In the wake of the Kyoto Protocol on global warming, states will have a need for international inspections regarding the emissions of greenhouse gases from their territories. And under various fisheries conventions, there are needs for inspection of ships of foreign nationality. It is getting common also that foreign observers are invited for elections, although that is not strictly an inspection. Undoubtedly, states will accept more international oversight and activities over activities under their jurisdiction because they find it to be in their interest to do so. Yet, the instinctive national demand for exclusive control will often lead them to wave the sovereignty flag, just as we, as individuals, sometimes wave the personal integrity flag when we don't like Big Brother to come in. There will, accordingly, frequently be some tension in the drawing up of the rules concerning inspectors' access to documents, sites, and persons. Verification and inspection sometimes take on a more difficult and dramatic character, and in the case of Iraq, during the 1990s, for instance, it was carried out in the presence of state escorts, minders we call them, who might or might not open doors to buildings and rooms which the inspectors wanted to see. In 2002 and 2003, foreign troops were poised to attack and invade Iraq when the inspectors were there, and the troops eventually did so. The sheer organization and logistics of an inspection operation like Iraq raised problems which are difficult, even though Iraq was obliged to help and to facilitate inspections, and was in fact mostly helpful to Andolik during the 3.5 months it performed inspections. There was a need to lodge several hundred of inspectors and other staff and to deploy them with integrity in a totalitarian country. You need offices and laboratories that are secure, encrypted communication by fax and scrambled telephone. You need also to send messages that are so confidential that you must avoid all electronic communication and make them hand-carried. You need lots of vehicles, ground-penetrating radar, and other specialized equipment. You need a base outside inspected territory, and in our case, we selected Cyprus. You need eyes in the sky, surveillance from above, to take pictures from various angles, and you compare them with pictures taken years back to enable you to see what changes have occurred in industrial and other installations during several years' time. At the top level, there are satellites whose pictures of 1 meter resolution, those were the ones we could get, you can buy commercially today. At the next level you have U-2 planes placed at your disposal by the United States. And at the next level still you have French Mirage planes with the compliments of the French government. And at the next altitude, lower again, Russian Antonovs, which have the advantage of night vision. And at the very bottom, we were about to get, but we didn't have the time to get it, were German drones, which promised observation at the lowest level. So it was a nice pie of surveillance from above that gave a lot of staff work to coordinate for maximum information to the inspectors who could enter any installations they demanded to see on the ground. Now, to illustrate the political interest in and the tension about various international cases of inspection, you need not to lead through many pages of the daily newspapers. And let me give you some current examples. In Iran, the IAEA has been engaged for many months in mapping the country's program of enriched uranium. Such a program is not prohibited under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to which Iran is a party. The problem has been that Iran has failed to observe its duty under the safeguards agreement with the agency to report about the activity, and this has understandably raised suspicions about the intentions. If you can enrich uranium to 5%, as Iran certainly can, then you can also, and 5% is what you need for nuclear fuel, around that 5%. But if you can enrich to 5%, you can also enrich to 85%, which is the level that you would need for making a nuclear weapon. All nuclear material leaves wonderful fingerprints, and in the case of Iran, the IAEA is able to see on pieces of equipment which level of enrichment has been attained. They just take a piece of cloth and get some dust and put it in a plastic bag and take it to labs and analyze it, and you can see what level of enrichment they are dealing with. It's pretty smart. They can also even see calculate from where did the material come if it didn't originate in Iran. The IAEA concluded that some of it came from Pakistan because they knew something about the Pakistani enrichment effort. And some situation, I think they were suspected that some of the material came from Russia, but I think they wrote that off after examining what the Russian material normally would have. Now, the case of Republic of Korea, in that case, the agency established following a declaration by the government that a very tiny quantity of uranium had been enriched without subsequent required reporting. In Iraq, the IAEA has said that although it is not enabled now and after the war 2003 to have inspections on the ground, it can see on satellite images that equipment which they used to check and which they had tagged could be used in weapons program had disappeared. They can see that on the recent satellite pictures. and they might be looted. The problem is they don't know where have they gone since they were looted. So they can see quite a lot. In Libya, the program was revealed earlier this year to make a nuclear weapon. This had not been discovered by the IAEA. It followed the seizure of a ship under German flag carrying equipment for the enrichment of uranium. Libya, we have learned since, had bought the design of a nuclear weapon from the father of the Pakistani nuclear bomb, Dr. Khan, and the whole network of clandestine business channels for nuclear trade was revealed. While this may well have contravened Pakistani law and was politically certainly highly embarrassing for Pakistan, Pakistan, nevertheless, not being a party to the non-proliferation treaty, had not been obliged under international law to prevent the trade. In the Sea of Japan, naval exercise was recently held, and still on some examples of the current tension around inspection. The naval exercise was recently held by Japan, the United States and Australia, and a number of other states within the framework of the so-called Proliferation Security Initiative. Under this initiative by the US government, the parties aim at catching any illicit transport of weapons of mass destruction or material and equipment relevant to such weapons. The only known successful intervention so far was the transport to Libya, which I mentioned a moment ago. The participants in this initiative, ESI, mutually grant each other and other states, which so agree, the right to board ships and aircraft carrying their flag on suspicious trafficking. But the Libyan case is so far the only one that we know can carry out. It would seem probable that in a world moving towards less weapons, fewer weapons, notably fewer weapons of mass destruction, extensive verification and on-site inspection will be indispensable to give confidence against unwelcome surprises. For instance, if an agreement were to be reached setting a ceiling at 1,000 for nuclear weapons, non-detection of, say, 10 or even 100 over that number might perhaps not matter much in terms of security. But if the commitment were to have been to zero nuclear weapons, if they have really said we go down to zero, then non-detection even of one would be or could be a dramatic matter. Well, we are not likely to get to such far-reaching commitments anytime soon. Where are we then going with disarmament and with inspection in connection with disarmament? Today, the traditional sources of conflict and war, claims to territory or ideological differences, are not present between great powers and blocs, if indeed there are any blocs any longer. The global outlook is hopeful after the collapse of world communism and the outbreak of détente. I'm not someone who is longing back to the stability of détente. It was a much more dangerous situation. Nevertheless, most global disarmament efforts are presently at a standstill. It is curious that at a time when countries like Russia and China, which in the past were stiffly against international inspection, have finally turned around, the United States has developed a skeptical attitude to inspection. The current U.S. attitude does not raise expectations for any institutional cooperation or expansion of institutional cooperation. With the U.S. and Russia together today holding nearly 30,000 nuclear weapons, the world will have time to ponder how to get to global disarmament and zero weapons of mass destruction. It's sometime further down the line. It will take more than just a technical verification. Something it will require a global institution to control the weapons. However, who would control that institution? It is sometime down the line. I shall not speculate about the future of the UN or world disarmament and inspection. Rather, let me for a moment trace the roots of inspection. During the 19th century, we find strong humanitarian-based efforts to prohibit the use of certain types of weapons. I mentioned those in my first lecture, and I cited the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration, which prohibited the use of certain kinds of explosive bullets. In 1899, other bans in one of the 8 conventions on the use were agreed regarding the dum-dum bullet, which flattened against the human body and was deemed to cause unnecessary suffering. The use of deleterious and asphyxiating gases and poison was also prohibited. And after the First World War, during which extensive use was made of gas, the Geneva Protocol of 1925 amplified the ban on the use of poison and gases from 1899 to cover both gases and bacteriological means and methods of warfare. A common feature in all these bans was that no mechanism was attached for verification of any alleged violations. It was thought that the use would be manifest and that the risk of retaliation would deter from non-compliance. I jump then to the partial test ban from 1925 and the partial test ban of 1963, which had as its primary aim to prevent further radioactive fallout in the atmosphere. Like the pre-war instruments, the 25 Protocol, it had no mechanism for inspection. It was not deemed necessary, as a violation would be registered through the fallout in the atmosphere, fallout on the ground. During this period, the Soviet Union urged the adoption of the Treaty for General and Complete Disarmament under what they termed effective international control. It sounded good, but was a Soviet propaganda exercise. The effective international control proposed was meant to be an international presence when agreed quantities of weapons were being destroyed. There would be no verification for how much remained, nor any verification to see whether any new weapons were produced of the same kind after the destruction. At this time, the Soviet Union was a closed society which regarded any intrusive inspection as espionage, and which saw a tactical military advantage in the secrecy about its arsenals. One must remember that hiding the truth about arsenals can mean either that there are more weapons than assumed. Intelligence often points to the worst-case scenarios, or that there are less weapons than we assume. Saddam Hussein, it turns out, ordered the destruction of Iraq's biological and chemical weapons in the summer of 1991 in order to be able to demand of the UN that economic sanctions should be lifted by the Security Council. But at the same time, he behaved as if weapons were still hidden. One explanation being that he wanted to create the impression that he was still dangerous. He hung the sign, "Beware of dog," without having a dog. The Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1960 was the first arms control treaty that required verification and on-site inspection. There was a double bargain in this treaty. The non-nuclear weapon states committed themselves not to develop or otherwise acquire nuclear weapons and to accept IAEA safeguards inspections on all their present and future nuclear material and equipment. And the 5 great powers, which were members of the Security Council, the P5, and which had already tested nuclear weapons, were required under the treaty to conduct negotiations in good faith about a cessation of the nuclear arms race, about nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament under effective international control. These obligations could not be subjected to inspection. The NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has often been criticized as an unequal treaty. The critics have not really contended that the treaty violated the rules of the Vienna Convention or jus cogens. They have rather said that the two types of obligations in the treaty were not balanced. That like some treaties from the colonial time, one party contracted all the advantages and the other party all the burdens. The commitment not to acquire nuclear weapons and to accept on-site inspections were clear-cut and substantial commitments. To negotiate in good faith, a pactum in contrahendo, was not much of a burden. Nevertheless, the nuclear weapon states parties have joined voluntarily, and as parties they had been promised access to peaceful nuclear technology and material, which might not otherwise have been made available. This is incidentally one of the complaints of Iran about having joined the non-proliferation treaty. They do not find that any purchase on their part of nuclear technology has been facilitated, as the NPT would say. The nuclear weapon states have also committed themselves, with some reservations, not to attack non-nuclear weapon states parties. And as a goodwill gesture, they have also, with some variations, accepted IAEA inspections, but of course only on their peaceful nuclear installations. What is of particular interest to note is that while the ultimate aim of the NPT, like the older weapons bans, is undoubtedly to reduce the risk that any further use be made of the weapons, it sees non-possession as the most reliable way of achieving non-use. The safest nuclear weapon is the one you don't have. Moreover, to create confidence that parties abide by this commitment and not hide anything in their clauses. And last, transparency is institutionalized through declarations of all nuclear activities and through IAEA verification of the declarations and on-site inspection. With the safeguard system of the IAEA, the first global on-site inspection system was born. A standard safeguards agreement called, under the NPT, called INCIRC 153, famous number, was developed, specifying the rights and obligations of the states and of the agency under the verification system. This was a quantum leap forward, and the aim was to create confidence and compliance. There were, however, severe limitations in the system, which was designed primarily with democratic, industrialized, non-nuclear weapon states in mind, like Germany, Japan, Sweden, Switzerland, and Austria. These were the states which in 1968 were embarking on the peaceful use of nuclear energy and could theoretically divert material from the peaceful sector to the military. However, in open societies of this type, the concealment of large, non-declared nuclear installations would not be easy. The chief concern was, as I said, about the diversion of nuclear material in declared facilities. While the inspected states were eager to rely on independent verification and inspection to create confidence about their peaceful nuclear activity, on-site international inspection was nevertheless felt by them as an intrusion. It was feared that it could lead to the leakage of industrial and commercial secrets, especially as the nuclear weapon state, the US and the other P4, they were not submitted to inspection and they were thought to be getting a commercial advantage in not having an inspection. The result in the NPT and the negotiations about this on-site control were some significant limitations. On-site inspections were focused on declared nuclear facilities, and in these installations on so-called strategic points. Inspectors were not a runabout, but they were focused on strategic points, which should be enough. Theoretically, access could be gained to non-declared sites through so-called special inspection. However, without at that time having any access to satellite images which would point to suspected installation, or any access to intelligence from member states pointing to such sites, the IAEA had limited possibilities to identify sites which would warrant special inspections, and they could not just go at random in large countries to search for them. The inspected states also had the right to reject inspectors, and frequently did so, or refused visas without presenting any reasons. It was an undermining of the principle that inspectors were international civil servants whose nationalities should be available. And in the UNSCOM and the UNOVIC system in Iraq, we never accepted any such things. We decided who were the inspectors, and Iraq never had an opportunity to reject inspectors. It was realized in 1968 when the IAEA safeguard system was constructed that lab-scale activities to enrich uranium or to produce plutonium or diversion or loss of small quantities of such material could hardly be detected. The IAEA could not have detected the 1 gram that the South Koreans had enriched. This is too small. The ambition, even though it leaves fingerprints, The ambition would have been to set at detecting the diversion of what was termed significant quantities, and these were set at 8 kilograms of plutonium or 25 kilograms of enriched uranium, which are the quantities that would be needed to make a bomb. As the system was designed to create confidence that nuclear material, in particular the enriched uranium or plutonium, the inspection effort was heavy on states having much such material. This resulted in a good deal of inspection in countries like Canada and Germany and Japan, which had much nuclear power and much nuclear material, and rather little in states like Libya, Iraq, and Iran, which had limited amounts of nuclear activities. Now, a police organization in a country can concentrate resources in areas which they consider to be high crime areas. But to respect the sovereign equality of state member states, an international organization is obliged to follow the principle that we have at airports. Whether we have long hair or we have short hair or however we are dressed, we go through the same control at the airport. So it was the same way with the inspection system of the IAEA. And it was also complained that, look, you should have the resources in Libya, not in Canada. And it's a difficulty in the system, but it's very difficult to get away from it. When in 1991 Iraq's cheating and nuclear weapons program were revealed, I declared that the IAEA needed greater access to sites, greater access to information, and, when needed, greater access to the Security Council. It was understood that the system that had failed to discover the clandestine activities in Iraq had to be upgraded. And by 1997, when I retired from the IAEA, 2 additional protocols were adopted through which the system was strengthened. A chief challenge is now to induce all parties to the NPT to accept the more effective safeguards which have resulted. And you might have seen that Iran has declared that they will accept it. They have not yet ratified the protocols, but they have said that they will apply it. And that's where we are with them at the moment. The ratification, I think, is probably with the rest of the items there in the diplomatic bazaar. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 only prohibited the use of gas and bacteriological means of warfare, methods of warfare. But at the initiative of President Nixon, a much more far-reaching convention was concluded in 1972, prohibiting both the use and the possession of biological weapons and toxins, and required the destruction of any stocks. The convention differed in some important respect from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It imposed the same obligations on all states, whereas in the NPT, if you recall, the P5 could continue to have nuclear weapons, but others were not. The Biological Convention ordered all states not to produce and not to have biological weapons. Those who had the weapons committed themselves not to acquire them, those who had not had them not to acquire them, and those who had them obliged themselves to destroy their stocks. There was no criticism here of any unequal treaty. It differed also in that it had no mechanism for verification and inspection. It was thought at the time that these weapons had limited military interest. Accordingly, no hurry was felt to impose a verification system on anybody. However, a party suspecting another party of violating the convention can complain to the Security Council, and all parties are obliged to cooperate with the Council in any investigation initiated by the Council. In the last decade, biotechnology has advanced very fast, and new horrifying types of pathogens can be developed, against which, for instance, no vaccination may be possible, or which may be designed to affect specific human groups, ethnic groups. The lack of a system to create confidence about compliance is felt at the present time as a severe shortcoming in the Bioconvention. The concern is felt the stronger as it is known since a good number of years that the Soviet Union secretly and on a very large scale violated the commitment it had undertaken under the Convention during the Cold War, which still was the Soviet Union. An outbreak of anthrax at Sverdlovsk was the first sign of this cheating. The enormous size of the Soviet program was made known after the end of the Cold War. After many years of work, a proposal for a verification system aiming at the verification and implementation of the Convention was worked out and was presented a few years ago. However, it was rejected by the US Bush administration, which, as I have shown, is generally skeptical to treaty-based verification and inspection systems. In 2006, a review conference is to be held for the Bio Convention, and there is at present a feeling of concern, not to say despair, among scientists and armed control professionals about getting to some meaningful verification system. Now, while the 1925 Geneva Protocol and the 1972 Bioweapons Convention, Toxic Convention, had no institutional verification mechanism, the General Assembly in 1982 adopted a resolution which authorized the Secretary General of the UN to appoint expert groups to examine reports about possible violations of the Geneva ban on the use of VLC weapons. This did not envisage verification of the 1972 Convention on bans of the production, only on the 1925 Protocol of use. Nevertheless, it was of some use. In March 1984 and March 1986, the Secretary General did send expert groups which examined and affirmed the charges that Iraq had used sea weapons into a war with Iran. And as is well known, the regime of Saddam Hussein also used sea weapons in a horrible attack against civilian Iraqi Kurds at Fallujah. After many years of negotiations, the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling and Use of Chemical Weapons and Their Destruction, the Convention was signed in 1993 in Paris. And like the B-Weapons Convention, it overlaps with the 1925 Geneva Protocol in the use aspect, and is also similar to that convention in containing the same obligations for all the parties, great powers or others, and in demanding the destruction of chemical stocks and in demanding no acquisition and no production. Unlike the B-Weapons Convention, however, it has the most elaborate system for verification and control. For this purpose, and to serve as a secretariat of the Convention, a permanent organization is established and located at The Hague, the so-called OPCW. The verification inspection system builds on the IAEA safeguard system but develops it further. It's a younger system and learned from it. And it took some 25 years, I think, to negotiate. There are elaborate rules concerning clarification, consultation, and challenge inspections. The conference of the parties can bring grave issues to the attention of the UN General Assembly and Security Council. An interesting and special feature in the verification system of the Sea Weapons Convention is so-called managed access, which has been introduced for the inspection of sensitive installations. It permits the inspected party to remove sensitive paper and to shroud sensitive equipment unrelated to the object of the inspection. See, that the more intrusive the system comes, the more troublesome it may be for a party that they have to show everything. So there may be a legitimate need for hiding something for commercial or technical reasons. And this convention then has a mechanism for it. After a few years of teething problems, the system seems to have matured. However, the obligation of the parties to destroy their stocks of chemical weapons has required very large and costly operations, and the work is still ongoing. There are still lots of chemical weapons in Russia, and it's a question of resources, of money to destroy them. It may be expensive to produce them, but it's also expensive to destroy them. At this point, let me break the chronological order for a moment and describe the verification system which exhibits the unusual feature of being in operation but not in force. I have in mind the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which was signed in 1996. The CTBT, as we call it, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, still lists ratifications of several states whose participation is a form of requirement of the treaty to enter into force, including the United States, whose Senate rejected the treaty, partly out of spite to Mr. Clinton, but also partly as a result of conservative opposition. Yet the treaty has for years had a provisional technical secretariat in Vienna, and it has recently declared itself fully operative, with parties and some non-parties paying the cost of the activities, including the United States part of the cost. The verification approach of the CTBT comprises no periodic visits by inspectors. But what will they visit? Empty test sites. Instead, any tests are to be detected through continuous seismological, radionuclide, hydroacoustic, and infrasound monitoring. For this purpose, an extensive network of stations is established around the whole world. It sends data continuously and in real time to the Secretariat Center in Vienna. And these data are compiled and then relayed to institutions in states parties to the treaty. And some of them do have the technical and scientific capability to interpret the signals and to verify if there have been any illegal tests. An executive council of the parties, but not the head of the technical secretariat, can decide on on-site inspection at the request of the party if it is not satisfied about the explanation given. No tests have fortunately been registered since the treaty was signed, but if this moratorium on testing, nuclear testing, the French ones were the last ever, if that moratorium were to be broken by the United States, which is exploring new types of nuclear weapons, the regime might collapse and we might have more nuclear weapons tests. For the time being, the information relayed by the Secretariat in Vienna is eagerly consumed by states around the world, not so much to spot nuclear tests as to help them to predict earthquakes. So the system has a double use. At the end of the Gulf War in 1991, the Security Council adopted Resolution 687 in 1991 as a part of the ceasefire with Iraq. Iraq was obliged to eradicate all nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons programs and the means to deliver such weapons. It was to declare all items related to them and to accept drastic verification and inspection. If, to quote Clausewitz, war is a continued diplomacy without means, what we had here was inspection continuing war without means. The pressure upon Iraq to comply was significant. No state was allowed to buy Iraqi oil until the Security Council, after reports by inspectors, concluded that all the weapons were eradicated. Iraq lost practically all its export income until the oil for food program started, when it was allowed to use the proceeds to buy non-weapons related items like food and so forth. It was thought that the Iraqi government would promptly and correctly declare all prohibited items and to help to destroy them and fully cooperate with the IAEA in the nuclear field and UNSCOM in the other fields. This proved in important respects to be an erroneous expectation. We now have good reasons to believe that all biological weapons and a good deal of the chemical weapons and nuclear equipment were in fact unilaterally destroyed in the summer of 1991, which is what Iraq has consistently been contending. But we did not believe. Large quantities of chemical weapons and many missiles were declared by Iraq and later destroyed by UNSCOM supervision. What was not declared was the evolution, the explanation of how the program had evolved, especially the nuclear and biological ones. They did not voluntarily explain. And what was also not declared were installations related to the programs. Iraq, no doubt, sought to rescue costly infrastructure which could be used for possible future revival of the program or for other industrial peaceful purposes. Inspection authorities, however, succeeded in mapping these installations, and they were demolished under their supervision. And all relevant nuclear material was flown out of Iraq to Russia. In an exchange of letters from the 14th of May 1991, let's say shortly after the Gulf War, it was between the Secretary General and the Iraqi Foreign Minister, the rights of inspectors were specified, and I'll cite some examples of the rights. Unrestricted freedom of movement without notice within Iraq. Unimpeded access to any site or facility for the purpose of on-site inspection. Right to request, receive, examine and copy any relevant data or information. Right to designate any site whatsoever for observation, inspection or other monitoring. And as if this was not enough, a new Security Council resolution adopted in October of the same year, 1991, specified further rights given for the purpose of monitoring and verification. For instance, to stop and inspect vehicles, ships and aircraft, however we were to do that, or any other means of transportation within Iraq. And secondly, these are just examples, to inspect imports or exports of material and other items upon arrival and departure. So there was nothing very limited about the inspection rights that we had, and even so, we were not able to find out in the 1990s that things had been destroyed. Inspections in Iraq under the regime established in 1991 ended when inspectors were withdrawn towards the end of 1998 after a rather long period during which the Iraqi side had put obstacles in the way of many inspection efforts. A new resolution at the end of 1999 established UNMOVIC to succeed UNSCOM, whose reputation had been tarnished when it was understood that the US and the UK sent experts from their special forces to join the UN inspection teams. This had placed the independence of the UN inspections in doubt and raised the suspicion that such experts might provide targeting information for US and UK bombings undertaken to enforce the controversial program which these countries pursued to maintain the no-fly zones in Iraq. UNMOVIC, which succeeded UNSCOM, and which I headed UNMOVIC, was given the same task as UNSCOM had, but it took several measures to become a genuinely independent UN authority. Thus, while welcoming intelligence from member states, especially regarding sites to be inspected and to serve inspection, it saw this and other assistance from member states as a mainly one-way street. At no time would it allow itself to become a prolonged arm of any national intelligence. From the very outset, the new Commission's independence was strengthened by independent financing, part 0.8% of the proceeds of the Oil for Food program. And we had much less dependence on assistance from the big Western members. There was no longer a deputy chairman of the US nationality, which UNSCOM had always had. And UNMOVIC discontinued the practice of holding briefings and debriefings of its inspectors at the US naval base in Bahrain. UNMOVIC's staff was mainly on regular UN contracts, and they were all given solid training by us for their task, including knowledge about the independent UN mandate. Although UNMOVIC was established in 2000, it was not until October 2002 that Iraq declared itself ready to receive inspectors again. The terror attacks on the US on 9/11 in 2001 and the increase in US military build-up in the Gulf area as of the summer of 2002 had put Iraq under pressure. And in October, the Security Council adopted yet another resolution which left the Iraqis with very little leeway against inspectors, whether regarding U-2 planes or in the air for private interrogations on the ground. During the 3.5 months that UNMOVIC inspections were pursued before the US and UK-led invasion occurred, some 700 inspections were performed at some 500 sites. Access was invariably given promptly, even at presidential sites. A small number of relevant items was found, and a category of missiles was deemed illegal and ordered destroyed. However, no smoking guns were found, and several dozens of sites recommended for inspection by various intelligence agencies were found to have no proscribed items. While the assertiveness about Iraq illegally retaining weapons of mass destruction grew in the winter of 2002-2003, particularly in Washington, the credibility of the evidence relied upon weakened. So it was like two curves. The conservative assertiveness went up and the credibility went down. When the invasion of Iraq took place, the inspecting authorities, UNMOVIC and the IA, could not exclude that prohibited items still remained in Iraq, but they had also no convincing evidence to that effect, whether of their own or from any government. We reported this, and we reported also the doubts we had about some of the evidence presented, including some of the evidence presented by Secretary of State Colin Powell. Within a few months after the invasion, American investigators had interrogated a large number of scientists, military personnel, and administrators, and offered rewards for information leading to prohibited items, but only received the answer that the respondents did not know of any weapon stocks. In September 2003 then, and in October 2004, the successive heads of the US-Iraq Survey Group, David Kay and Charles Delfer, reported that while there were violations of the restrictions relating to the missile range, there were no weapons of mass destruction. Nevertheless, according to Mr. Delfer, persons close to Saddam Hussein had the impression that he intended to revive programs for weapons of mass destruction if and when sanctions were lifted. Sounds like an unusual respect for the sanctions from his part. There was no documentation on his intention. And there were, of course, no plans in the Security Council to lift sanctions, and even less any plans to drop the monitoring of Iran for the future. Now let me come to the conclusions. Note some important experiences based on the material that I have discussed, in particular the material from nearly 8 years of verification and inspection in Iraq. First, the war proved, and still is proving, to be a very expensive way of finding out that no weapons existed. A few months more of inspection might have achieved nearly the same certainty at a fraction of cost of money and at no cost in lives. Nearly 8 years of highly intrusive inspections in Iraq, backed by economic, diplomatic, and military pressure, led to the eradication of the program through measures by the Iraqi regime and by the inspection authorities. It was, one might say, that a case of success in disarmament without really knowing it. The nuclear program was fully mapped, and few questions of any significance remained. Yet, while no proscribed items of any significance were found, the inspection authorities could not exclude that some weapons and other prohibited items remain in Iraq. To prove the negative was difficult for the Iraqi side, and even more difficult for the inspection authorities, which did not have the knowledge and control of all relevant personnel and archives in Iraq. It is simply not practically possible to ensure the detection of small relevant pieces in a large country. While nuclear material leaves strong fingerprints and modern methods of environmental sampling, which I mentioned, are powerful tools for inspection, there are items which do not leave traces. Metals simply haven't been used. Even with the best verification and inspection system will thus always leave some residue of uncertainty. To construct one that is foolproof, I don't think it's possible. But if it were, it would be very costly. It would also lead to many false signals. Inspection is rather like the radar scanning the sky, seeing what is here and now, but less likely to read intentions and the future. It is neither possible in medicine nor in inspection activities to give a clean bill of health, of actual or future health. This doesn't mean that it's a matter of indifference how thorough and professional inspections are. The more thorough, the greater the probability that the absence of any finding of relevant items is due to there being none. So thorough inspections, yes, it is meaningful. Inspection authorities must always indicate to their consumers, to the government, to what degree of certainty their assessments are made. In the last report we're short, it is a political task and judgment what degree of uncertainty is tolerable to governments. In the case of Iraq, Iran, and the DPRK, North Korea, not much benefit of the doubt is given. In cases like Brazil, Republic of Korea, the benefit of the doubt is much more likely to be given. The case of Iraq cheating under the traditional IAEA safeguards showed their inadequacy. The case of Libya showed the same thing and demonstrated the value of national intelligence to spot proliferation. By contrast, the case of North Korea in 1992 and Iran in 2004 show how much can be learned through a modern professional operation of international verification and inspection. International verification and inspection authorities need to retain their independence to remain credible internationally and to have a better chance of being accepted by the inspected party. However, they also need the diplomatic, economic and military support and pressure that governments and the Security Council can bring to bear. While the international inspection authorities have the great advantage and the legal right to access to sites and installations of aircraft, as I mentioned, documents and persons in an inspected state. National intelligence have other sources, like electronic surveillance and like espionage. There is therefore a strong case to combine the two tools and enable international inspections to obtain some intelligence in a one-way traffic. Any reverse traffic, that's to say information from inspections to the intelligence agency, would compromise the role of international authority in the eyes of the inspected party and make the inspection authority look like a remote control instrument of foreign intelligence. Inspection and verification aims at establishing facts. If it is effective and not cosmetic, it may deter some potential violators from going ahead. It may also reveal and provide timely warning about possible violations and enable international organizations and governments to take political, economic, or indeed military measures to prevent violations or further violations of the agreements entered into. Even a country that is difficult will not cooperate will say a sign that non-cooperation may be a sign that something is wrong. To establish facts, you need critical thinking, and I'm glad to say that at the university. Critical thinking is fundamental not only in inspection, but everywhere in our walks of life. The experience in the case of Iraq was that national intelligence services, but not international inspection authorities, bent their reporting to support conclusions which were politically desired by their governments. Regrettably, the erroneous diagnosis of the national authorities was followed, and the results of the international inspectors were ignored.